Which city would you pick for each of us to live in?
I think for them, it will be more in the east.
What city would I live in?
You are more like Taipei. Yeah, you're just Taipei.
From Frequency Media, this is Globocurious, an immersive travel podcast about the magic of curiosity, discovery, and human connection. I'm Michelle Corey, and this week we're headed to a vibrant city where the tumultuous past meets an unstoppable future, Taipei. Steam clouds billowed from vents scattered along the viewpoint of Yangmingshan Mountain. The smell of sulfur tells the story of millions of years of volcanic activity in this, one of Taiwan's 9 national parks. I activated my unshakable producer's grip around the recorder while pointing the boom mic toward one of the hissing fumaroles. My rosy cheeks were kissed by the cold wind whipping through the tall grassy mounds. In the background, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel paths. My friends, old and new, giggling and chatting. My immeasurably full heart ached in anticipation. It was the last day of our 2-week tour through Western Taiwan, half of which we spent in its capital city of Taipei. I didn't want to miss a single sound. Even though I had literally recorded my whole experience there, I was terrified that this had all been a dream, and that the next day I would wake up to only a fuzzy recollection of blurred faces and unrecognizable places. After all, it was in Taipei that my years-long search finally came to an end. Something had been pulling, or perhaps summoning me, to East Asia for years. I had watched a couple of Taiwanese shows that made me curious about the country and its people. And so, I decided this island, only 81 miles southwest of China and 120 miles north of the Philippines, would be my first destination in the Far East. It's amazing what an impact media can have on our curiosity about the world. But that's a deeper conversation I'll save for Substack. I arrived in Taipei at 8 p.m., beaming from the moment I rushed through Taoyuan International Airport to grab my suitcase. My Cheshire Cat grin lasted from the moment I stepped into the taxi to the moment it dropped me off at our centrally located Airbnb. Like all long-haul journeys, the delirium of time-bending travel and patchy hours of upright sleep marbled with the surreal joy of finally being somewhere I dreamt of visiting for so long. My friends and I were meeting at a nearby Japanese restaurant, one of countless in Taipei. The walk to the restaurant gave me a brief taste of the city's ineffable charm. Taipei is beautiful in a way that's hard to define. Gritty yet graceful, clean yet full of rough edges. Its charm isn't polished, but lived in, warm, and layered with history. It's a city that hums with contradictions, where beauty isn't just seen, but felt. I approached the restaurant and the scent of grilled fish and miso filled the air. Norin curtains swayed gently in the cool winter breeze as I stepped inside. The server welcomed me with a warm smile and handed me a menu. He paused, looked at me, and asked, "Do you live in Taipei?" I laughed. "No, actually, it's my first hour here." To my surprise, he responded with, "Oh, you look like you could live here." Little did I know, with just those few words, a seed had been planted. The first utterance of a whisper that would only grow louder. After a full night's rest, I bounced out of bed ready for our first day in Taiwan's best-known and third-largest city. My friend Moth, a talented, multidisciplinary artist who is Taiwanese-American, and her partner Sam were my travel buddies for the trip. Fate had its hand in this trip early on. Moth and I met years ago, before I founded and grew my podcast production company, when I was just a fledgling independent podcaster interviewing artists of all kinds who inspired me. We clicked when she, known at the time as Lady Clementine, came on the Cultured podcast to talk about her music. Our friendship has been steeping since then, for many years defined only by the occasional text or DM. In the past year, those texts grew more frequent, and that potential for closeness that always seemed to linger just below the surface unfurled. I had already booked my flight to Taiwan, planning to make this a solo adventure. When I shared my plans with Moth, she responded with a coy smile. She and Sam were planning the same trip at the same time. And just like that, solo became trio. We had decided to start our first day the Taiwanese way, at Yongji, a classic soy milk restaurant where people gather for warm bowls of fresh soy milk, fluffy baozi, and savory luobogao. We walked in, immediately enraptured by the scent of sizzling scallions and frying dough. Behind the counter, a middle-aged man with a backward cap and a kind face moved with expert efficiency, pouring steaming soy milk into cups and folding the egg crepes with practiced ease. I approached the counter, Google Translate at the ready, a lump of nerves in my throat as I began trying to communicate about my order and gluten allergy. I had been learning Mandarin haphazardly for many months, but my pronunciation was too rough for him to understand. I prepared for the inevitable moment I've faced countless times in the US, and even in my famously friendly motherland of Colombia. The frustrated glare that silently scolds, "I'm too busy to deal with you." But it never came. Instead, he and the people in line behind me exuded an innate patience.
Oh, yes. Do you speak English? I'm allergic to gluten.
那个萝卜糕里面有麦粉吗？
没有，它是那个萝卜跟那个米。
That is the sound of a woman at a nearby table who, completely unprompted, offered to bridge the language gap. Feeling grateful and cared for, I sat down with my friends just before the owner brought our food. I took my first bite of the luobogao, crispy-edged radish cakes that are soft in the middle and packed with scallions. And immediately, I knew I'd be ordering this for the rest of the trip. The danbing, or egg crepes, had the kind of umami flavor and chewy texture that makes this simple kind of dish unforgettable. Practically high from the levels of deliciousness we had just experienced, we stepped out onto the streets of Taipei, marching toward the MRT station. I began to tune into the city's rhythm, or rather, its melody. Because despite being the booming capital of Taiwan, Taipei City doesn't hold the same frantic, chaotic energy of some other major cities. Rather, it seems to exist in a state of steady flow. The sidewalks are wide and spotless, the streets orderly no matter the level of traffic. Even in its denser pockets, Taipei moves with an unspoken chill. No anxiety-fueled rushing, no rageful honks, no undertones of panic. A growing adoration was beginning to overcome me, and though I was trying to stay measured, no place is perfect after all, descending into the MRT station only made me fangirl even harder. I expected the usual subway flourishes, gum-spotted floors, grungy walls, the signature scent you get when you pack too many people in too small a space. But instead, I found myself in a bright, gleaming station, floors clean, completely free of heinous odors. No litter, no graffiti, no chaos. Moments later, I was standing on the platform watching the arrival times tick down in near perfect accuracy. The trains glided in like clockwork, and once inside, the same orderliness. No eating, no loud talking, no mindless seat hogging, just calm, comfortable transport. I would soon learn that Taiwan's impeccable public transit is, in part, a legacy of Japanese rule. During their 50-year colonization of Taiwan, the Japanese built extensive railway systems, introducing the kind of infrastructure that would shape Taiwan's future. And while the Japanese occupation left deep wounds, we'll get to that, this commitment to efficiency and precision remained in Taiwan's DNA. That first MRT ride set the tone for the rest of the trip. Whether it was hopping between cities on the high-speed rail or navigating local buses, day-to-day journeying there was just so easy. Ease. Maybe that's what I was picking up from the Taiwanese shows I watched and the Reddit forums I scoured. The idea of an easeful life has been on my mind for years. When I picked Taiwan as the next destination for Globocurious, I was following a breadcrumb trail of clues that I hoped would lead me to that all-elusive feeling. As I shared my plans with friends and family, I realized just how little my microcosm and I knew about Taiwan. In fact, the most popular question I got when I told someone about my trip was, why? It should have been an easy question for an overthinking overplanner like me, and yet I was consistently left bewildered by it. I just feel drawn there, I'd say, after searching for more eloquent responses that never came. Now, after 2 weeks of traveling through this singular country, after being pulled into its melodic pace and swaddled in its kindness, after being taught new definitions for community and comfort, and yes, after finding ease. Even now, after all of that, I find it difficult to define. I can and will tell you all about its difficult history and describe its extraordinary creativity and gush about its wonderfully warm people, but I already know that I won't succeed in adequately capturing its spirit. Because if I've learned anything about Taiwan, it's that this is a place, a culture, a community that refuses to be captured. I imagine the revolutionary spirit of Taiwan comes from just kind of being fed up with hundreds of years of being claimed on behalf of other people and nations?
I think so, yeah. I think that is the history that it comes from. Where like, why is everybody trying to tell us who we are and what our national identity should be? But at the same time, I think for most Taiwanese people, we don't know what our national identity is.
Right. You haven't had a chance to form it.
Yeah. And it's very much just like, okay, we know that we are Taiwanese, but what does it mean to be Taiwanese?
Right.
It's a big question mark.
That's our guide, Taipei. We walked through 228 Peace Memorial Park, a sprawling green space home to monuments and historic buildings. For our first day in Taipei, I had one goal: jump straight into Taiwan's history and culture. Simple enough, right? Well, not quite. Thankfully, I had booked a half-day walking tour that, at the very least, offered a foundation to build on brick by brick over the weeks to come.
Welcome to Tour Me Away. My name is Taipei, and I'll be your tour guide today. So I am actually Taiwanese. My father is from here, and my mother is from the US, and I was born and grew up here. And I went to local schools here, and I always thought it was very strange that, we learned so much actually about Chinese history, and we learned so much about the history of the past. But when it comes to recent history, last 50, 60 years, it's really quickly skipped over. And I always thought it really should be the other way around. We should be learning more about the things that happened more recently. It's impacting us the most. So
I had arrived with no previous exposure to Taiwan's history. If Taipei, who grew up there, was confused, you can only imagine how I felt. For the remainder of my trip, I was fueled by my very own age of exploration, speaking to everyone I could about Taiwan's past. What I discovered was a mosaic of voices that, only when put together, left me with a far more complete understanding. Buckle up, because we're about to cover 400 years of history in just over 90 seconds.
Taiwan was already inhabited by many different indigenous tribes, but the Portuguese actually never colonized Taiwan. They passed by Taiwan. They were very surprised this was not on the map.
The Dutch came to have a place to trade with Chinese. They were actually kicked out by Zheng Zhenggong, the Goxinga.
The pirate king of the South China Sea. The Ming Emperor decided to hire him to be the military general. Manchurians were invading from the north, finally defeating the Ming dynasty and establishing the Qing dynasty. They captured this pirate king turned military general, but his son
Came to Taiwan in order to try to fight back the Qing dynasty.
So he had to fight the Dutch and drive them away. After a few decades, the Qing emperor sent troops to Taiwan. So now Taiwan came under the rule of the Qing dynasty.
Qing dynasty is too big enough. They don't want to come. They just claim that, okay, we own this place.
But fast forward to the late 1800s, Japanese won the Sino-Japanese War against the Qing dynasty and gave up Taiwan to Japan.
Taiwan was independent before the Japanese came and after Qing dynasty.
Fast forward to the end of World War II,
Taiwan was bombarded by Americans because Taiwan was Japanese.
the Japanese lost the war. There was no more Qing dynasty left to give Taiwan back to. So at the same time,
The Communist Party rose up on the mainland.
there was the civil war going on in China between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists.
Mao Zedong fought Chiang Kai-shek when Chiang Kai-shek was fighting World War II with the Americans. He lost the civil war against Mao Zedong.
So the international powers at the time, namely the US, decided we should give Taiwan to the Chinese nationalists, the Republic of China, because they want to support their effort fighting the Chinese communists, the People's Republic of China. The Republic of China retreated to Taiwan completely.
That's the only escape for Chiang Kai-shek to reorganize his force.
Taiwan's history reads less like a clear timeline and more like a game of colonizer tag, a revolving door of empires staking their claim and exacting their rules and standards before the next wave arrived. Daile guided us through the shadows of Japanese-built buildings and past imposing northern Chinese landmarks to the 228 Peace Memorial Monument. We sat on a concrete bench in front of the two towering stone cubes, each tilted to stand precariously on one point while connected to each other by another point. A busker played behind us as locals meandered through the park's serene pathways. Amidst that calm, Daile revisited the time of Japanese rule to teach us about one of Taiwan's deepest wounds.
Japan needed the loyalty of the Taiwanese people, so they started what is known as the Japanization of Taiwan, encouraging Taiwanese people to speak Japanese, take on Japanese names, to only learn Japanese history in school.
In other words, a strategically engineered loyalty. For nearly 2 generations, Taiwanese people were trained out of their own culture. The language they spoke, the way they wrote their names, the history they were taught in school, all of it belonged to the empire. We continued our tour, exiting the park in order to see remnants of the city gates built by the Qing dynasty. These gates used to be connected to walls, of course, but the Japanese destroyed them upon arrival as part of their infrastructure changes. The scars of this colonizer do-si-do were everywhere. We crossed the street to a half-empty parking lot where a towering red and white brick building took up our view. This is the presidential office building built by the Japanese and then bombed by the Americans during World War II. I thought about what it must feel like to have lived through the changing demands of so many invaders, an ever-moving target. After the Japanese surrendered, Taiwan wasn't just left torn asunder by US air raids. It was also left with a fractured sense of identity. At first, the arrival of the Chinese nationalists felt like a return to something familiar. But identity isn't something you can just switch on and off like a light.
So initially, when the Republic of China came to Taiwan, the Taiwanese people were actually quite excited. The Chinese were saying things like, "Welcome back to the motherland, brothers and sisters." So it seemed like a chance for us to be treated like real citizens again. This excitement quickly turned to disappointment because when the Chinese came to Taiwan, what they saw looked like the Japanese that they had been fighting wars against for years and years. It was very upsetting for the Chinese to see this.
We followed Daile like ducklings to the next stop, this time a relic of the Qing dynasty, which ruled before Japan. Statues of a giant black leather shoe and a red high heel sat at the foot of a steel arch whose LED sign welcomed us to the Yuanling shopping district. We walked along the street passing original Baroque facades that hark back to the Qing era. something Chinese nationalists expected to see a lot more of when they took over from the Japanese. Instead, they encountered an island cloaked in Japanese influence, from architecture to attire. And so, Taiwanese people found themselves under yet another new regime that viewed them as culturally compromised. Economic exploitation followed. The new government seized private property, monopolized industries, and drained Taiwan's resources to fund its mainland war efforts. Resentment grew. Then came the spark. On February 27, 1947, a confrontation between officials and locals in Taipei escalated, leading to the death of a Taiwanese bystander. On February 28th, or 228, protests erupted across the island. Violence escalated. The nationalist government responded with overwhelming force. Thousands of Taiwanese people were arrested, executed, or disappeared in what became known as the 228 incident or massacre, a deep wound that still lingers in Taiwan's collective memory. Daile shared how this uprising gave cause for the nationalist government to further tighten its grip. Just over 2 years later, in May 1949, martial law was declared.
We like to think we have certain human rights, but under martial law, the military takes a lot of those rights away. Martial law in Taiwan lasted for 38 years, which is the second longest in the world. This was a period of time known as the White Terror, and this was also a time when there was a very severe language policy.
Under martial law, speaking Taiwanese, among many other acts, became dangerous.
The official language now is Chinese, because at this time in schools, they required children to only speak Chinese. If you were heard speaking Taiwanese or any other native languages, you would be fined, punished, humiliated.
After all, there is no greater way to control the masses than through fear. But what happens when that fear lasts decades? Taiwanese parents and their children quickly learned that speaking in their mother tongue could get them punished. And when fear lingers long enough, it doesn't just impact us behaviorally, it alters us physiologically. We now know that due to neuroplasticity, living in a constant state of fear rewires our brains.
A lot of people of that generation internalized shame around their native language, and they also kind of reluctant to speak Taiwanese to their children. So my dad's side of the family all speak Taiwanese, but they don't speak Taiwanese with me. It was until I was 20-something where I started learning about the history and realizing, this is very bizarre. Well, how come my grandmother only spoke Taiwanese? How come I cannot properly communicate with her? So I had to learn Taiwanese for myself later in my life.
This all felt familiar. I'd seen something like this before, in my own culture. Colombia, too, had been shaped by a history of war and oppression. Very different in its details, but also with a lasting generational impact. My mother was born in Bogotá at a time when the violence, literally known as la violencia, was just beginning. It's the only version of Colombia she knew before immigrating to the US. By the time I was born, the war had been raging for decades and would go on for 2 more. To this day, it feels like I carry la violencia in my DNA. I was raised to be hyper-aware, to continuously scan a room, to keep all doors and windows locked, to never, ever let my guard down. I was taught that a false sense of security could be dangerous, that fear wasn't just a feeling, it was a survival mechanism passed down like an heirloom. I was taught to see doors and locks and walls as my greatest allies. On the other hand, and much like Daile, my friend Moth had spent her childhood believing she had been shut out, never realizing that those locked doors were meant not to exclude, but to protect her. But now, the silence was starting to make sense.
I'm having so many light bulb moments with everything that you're saying about language and your family.
Your dad is Taiwanese?
Like, he was first generation. He's the only one of his brothers that was born in the States.
Did your family speak Taiwanese at all?
He spoke Taiwanese with his parents, but not with us.
They don't even know how to rationalize it. It's just an instinct.
He could never say why. No one would talk about it with us.
it's easy to think that this is like old history.
Right.
But then you say your dad
Yeah.
went to school
It
and
was-
you're young. In the US, immigrants there will not teach their children the language so they don't get
It was kind of like
mocked.
the reverse situation.
Yeah. And now we're learning the extra layer of her dad also experiencing that in his own country.
Yeah, in your own country. Yeah.
Gosh.
So it's even more of a slap in the face.
Right. Lost in thought, I sipped on a refreshing cup of ayu, a citrusy drink made with the jelly of a fig plant. We made our way from Zhongzheng into Ximending. Historic landmarks and government buildings gave way to bustling crosswalks and towering digital billboards. History is so often treated as something frozen in archives, detached from the present. But the past is what shapes the future. In that way, it endures, consciously and subconsciously. It lives on through the stories that are told or left untold, through what is remembered and what is lost.
Dark green, cavernous and tan.
Remember that last day of the trip spent amidst the whistling winds of Yangmingshan Mountain? Well, it was here, under a bright sky swirling with sulfuric steam, that moths sang into the mountain air. A voice both steady and aching, filling the volcanic void with longing.
Dark green, dark green.
Moth wrote Dark Green as part of a larger immersive installation by the same name. The song, which opens with the lyrics, "Dark green, cavernous and tan, I've been calling her at night, veiled and foggy," is inspired by her Taiwanese grandmother's penchant for plucking seeds from different places in order to transplant them into her own garden. A Super 8 camera captured Moth's gentle movements as the song continued, following the metaphor of the alien seed planted far from its native soil, yet shaped and also constituted by its new environment, as Moth herself describes it. I soon found myself thinking about that metaphor more and more. The way Taiwan had been shaped, reshaped, claimed, and reclaimed. Like a tea plant that had been pruned and picked at for generations, its roots gripping deep into the soil, holding onto something far older than the hands that tend to it. Its history has simmered and bloomed, each step revealing fresh nuances, impossible to separate one from the other. Poetically, tea is both a monumental part of Taiwanese history and also the perfect reflection of it. Once our walking tour was over, Sam raced over to Daile to ask her for tea shop recommendations. With her 2 suggestions in hand, he led the way to the first, a short walking distance from where the tour had ended in the bustling business district of Ximending. We walked into the tea shop called Fu Da Tong, and immediately, Sam and Moth came alive with wide-eyed wonder. They walked slowly in front of each ample wooden shelf, leaning in to read the details of every variety, closely inspecting each clay teapot and gaiwan. A petite woman emerged from the curtains that separated the roasting area with the front retail space. We greeted her as Sam's eyes looked from the tall tea counter to a much lower seating area that was clearly meant for tea tastings. We soon found ourselves sitting there where a gorgeous slab of raw-edged wood served as our tabletop. Sam and Moth had picked 3 teas for us to try. To our shock, the tasting came at no additional cost. This was simply the baked-in experience of selecting the right varieties. Slow, deliberate, intentional. A continuation of the energy that goes into cultivating premium quality tea.
But we changed the location.
The shop itself was a reflection of this, steeped in its own history and anchored by its own deep roots. In fact, the woman's family had opened this shop in 1845.
In here.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's special. That's amazing.
Carol, the owner's daughter, told us about how the shop had been on the same street in Ximending for 180 years, and how every sip of tea we were enjoying had been wok roasted by her family in the back room. Tea is clearly part of Carol's DNA. She handled it with an ingrained instinct, knowing exactly how long to brew each variety, how tightly or loosely the leaves should be packed, how many times it could be steeped. She was quiet, steady, calm. It was like watching a piano maestro playing with their eyes shut, striking each key from a place of sheer intuition. And yet, this didn't feel like an overly reverent moment. Between steepings, my friends and I chatted, finding common bonds and telling stories of our past, talking about each variety and then changing the subject to something entirely unrelated. I started to see the beauty of tea beyond the surface, the connection it can bring.
But I will.
Taiwan's history with tea is as layered and steeped in tradition as the drink itself. The Qing dynasty first brought large-scale tea cultivation to Taiwan in the 18th century, but it wasn't until the 19th century that the island became a major player in the global tea trade. By the mid-1800s, Taiwan was producing some of the most sought-after oolongs in the world, exported primarily to the west through the port of Damsui. What makes Taiwanese tea so special isn't just its quality, it's the philosophy behind it. While the island's mountainous terrain and humid climate create ideal growing conditions, it's the careful, deliberate craftsmanship that transforms these leaves into something remarkable. In Taiwan, tea is much more than a drink. It's a way of measuring time, care, respect. I realized this even more at our second tea stop of the day, where we met Jin, the owner of Yu Yu Tea House, an impeccably designed tea shop tucked away in the underground mall of the bustling Bangka Park. Unlike many of the tea shops in the area, Jin doesn't come from a long line of tea connoisseurs. In fact, most of her career was spent in trade. When she chose this path, she saw tea as more than a craft. She saw it as an important symbol of Taiwan's agricultural ethos.
Actually, because in Taiwan, we produce a lot, but the thing is we import it to balance the price. Because eating locally, produced locally, is very expensive.
Because it's limited supply.
No, it's because the quality is very good. The best teas are consumed in Taiwan. We don't export that. We export the bubble teas, but this is a different story. But the best teas are consumed in Taiwan. You cannot find elsewhere.
So I'm half Colombian.
Okay.
And I just went to Colombia, and it's the opposite issue there, where they export everything.
Yes.
So they export the best quality coffee.
Yes. The reason why is because Taiwan's economy is not based on agricultural product.
Yeah.
And also our labor is actually very expensive.
Right.
Yes, because to tell you the truth, a tea picker per day is paid around 2,000 to 6,000 NT dollar per day. Colombia, how much they get paid?
They get paid 12 cents every 2 pounds. 12 cents.
That's what, 1 kilo.
So
in
if
Taiwan,
they pick 80 kilos, can you imagine? They can make maybe $15 per day.
in Taiwan, 1 kilo is 90 NT, which is $3. This is different.
Imagine the difference between 12 cents and $3.
Yes, and so like in Taiwan, we don't need to state that with fair trade because it's normal to pay people decently.
Imagine that. Each leaf is treated with the same respect as the hands that cultivate it. At every turn, Taiwan seemed to prioritize quality, well-being, and respect. From the way food is prepared to the way public spaces are designed to the way people interact with one another, Taiwan simply cares. We left the tea shop feeling a kind of kindred connection with Jin. Thankfully, we reunited with her a week later, when she took us to visit her wild tea farm about an hour south of Taipei. By this point, we had experienced even more cultural nuances that we couldn't wait to discuss with our new friend Jin, who is a wealth of knowledge and curiosity. We sat in her tea factory at a small wooden table. Her business partner and tea farmer served us cup after cup of his signature teas. Behind him, the tea dryer spun a batch of freshly picked leaves, mimicking the sound of ocean waves hitting the shore. We told Jin how incredibly safe we felt navigating Taipei at any time of day or night, whether we were together or alone. According to Jin, that's just the Taiwanese way.
We believe in karma. If I attack you or I take advantage of you, this will come back to me.
That's a powerful belief system to shape a community.
And also because we're so small in the island, so we have this mutual trust, right? I sit beside you, I know you're not going to stab me. What if I'm just like going to watch you constantly? Oh, my life will be miserable.
That's how we feel.
Yes, but in Taiwan, everybody will be, at least I know like my the person next to me will be fine.
Yeah.
Yes. So like we can live peacefully together. Harmony.
Feel that here. We can feel that.
And it feels better.
It didn't just feel better, it felt transformative. If you've been on this journey with me from the first episodes, you may remember the little secret I told you during our dinner at the French Laundry. You know, the time I confessed to not being a foodie. Well, that was before Taiwan. It was as if I had entered a parallel universe where imaginary foods become reality, where every meal felt like the Lost Boys feast from the movie Hook. And no place made me feel that way more than Taipei's famous night markets. We visited Zhaohe, one of the cities best known to foreigners, and Nanjitang, one of the best known to locals. In both, we hopped from stall to stall, flowing with the steady movement of packed-out crowds, stopping wherever our taste buds told us to. Chewy sweet potato balls dusted in cinnamon, shrimp and pork rice rolls steamed before my very eyes, taro rice patties filled with melty cheese, a hot dog with a sticky rice bun, passion fruit ice cream sprinkled with crushed peanuts and cilantro wrapped in a rice paper burrito. We had been in Taipei for one day when we visited Zhaohe, which means my foodie awakening hadn't yet happened, and my nervous system was still on Western safety settings. I took all the necessary precautions of walking through hordes of strangers late at night, positioning my bag on my chest instead of my back, carefully guarding my phone and wallet, staying constantly aware of my surroundings. Priority 1, safety. Priority 2, enjoyment. In contrast, our visit to Nanjitang was in the last days of our 2-week trip. By then, each day had brought us a new encounter with kindness, had eased us with built-in comforts, had taught us what it feels like to be safe. By then, we had adjusted all of our settings to low danger mode. Priority 1, community. Priority 2, comfort. Here, stranger danger was replaced by stranger care. Here, a country that, like Colombia, had survived decades of government control and systemic oppression, I felt no walls, no guardedness. Taiwanese people weren't watching their backs the way I'd been taught to. They moved through their days unburdened by suspicion. It left me in awe. I saw what trauma had done to my people, to me. I saw how it had shaped who we are, how we act, what we believe in. And yet, in Taiwan, the outcome had been entirely different. Instead of suspicion, there was trust. Instead of walls, there was warmth. And if I was amazed by how strangers treat each other, nothing could have prepared me for how it feels to be treated like family. After spending days touring through Taipei, we stood outside of the MRT station as a sedan pulled up beside us. One of Moth's uncles appeared, radiating warmth as he ushered us into the car. Despite the strong language barrier, comfortable chatter filled the air. Just a few minutes later, Moth's uncle guided us through the parking garage and up to his apartment, where a huddled group of smiling faces were waiting to greet us at the front door. A feast was already laid out on the table, a mouth-watering spread of steaming bowls, fragrant broths, and carefully prepared dishes. A circle formed around Moth as the family she had only met once before flooded her with compliments and memories and hugs. They spoke to us like we belonged there. There was no hesitation, no distance, just the excitement of reunion. And as I watched Moth take it all in, the laughter, the familiarity, the clarity, I saw her relax, settle in, like a seed finding fertile soil.
Take your time,
Take your time, slow down, enjoy. As Americans, we're used to a fast pace in all things. Think fast, speak quickly, eat up, devour life before it devours you. No wonder my nervous system has never experienced peace. Until now. We spent the evening eating slowly, talking about life in Taipei, traditions, geopolitics, spiritual beliefs. I was offered a fork because my chopstick skills, which I'd always held in high regard, were not up to par. We were told to try the fish and to get more rice. My bowl was taken to be filled with chicken soup. "I'll do it for you," said Moth's uncle, who carried my bowl to the pot where the soup was being kept warm. "I'll make sure you get enough chicken." Care everywhere. The last few days in Taipei moved at the same rhythm as the rest of our trip. Comfortable, intentional, and filled with small, extraordinary moments. But this city was no longer just an introduction to a country I knew little about. It had become something familiar, something that had quietly, persistently settled into my bones. That last morning of our trip, we met up with Jin and Moth's Aunt Cindy, now part of our growing Taiwanese family, for that final outing to Yangmingshan Mountain. This was the very place where I began this story, afraid that I would wake up and find it had all been a dream. But Taiwan is real. Taipei is real. The way they made me feel, safe, seen, at ease in a way I had never known before, was deeply, undeniably real.
I mean, actually Taiwan is good to travel, but Taiwan is better to live. Because living is about every day. Yeah. You will appreciate Taiwan more if you live here.
What Jin didn't know was that much of my travels have had a side quest, finding my new home. With so much constant violence, corporate overreach, and community division, life in the US feels more like being planted in the trenches of a war zone rather than sun-drenched, nutrient-rich soil. My roots had long ago retracted, but my travels hadn't yet led me to that seemingly mythical place where my mind, body, and spirit would have an ensemble aha moment. Until now. Because here, at the top of this volcanic mountain, in the embrace of a country that asked nothing of me but to exist, I finally understood. I wasn't just visiting Taiwan. I was home. And just like that, our debut season of Globocurious has come to an end. To everyone who has joined me on this adventure, anyone who's listened, shared, and traveled alongside me, thank you. You've made this experience richer in ways I could never fully express. And if you, like me, can't just shut off your curiosity with the end of a podcast season, you don't have to wait until season 2. Follow me on Substack at Globocurious, where I share deeper reflections on the places I visit and the themes we explore. And of course, you can visit globocurious.com for travel guides, planning tips, and itinerary ideas. There's always more to explore, more to uncover, more stories waiting to be told. So until next time, stay curious. Globocurious is an original production of Frequency Media. I'm Michelle Corey, the host, writer, and executive producer. Lizzie Stewart is our producer. Claire Bidigary Curtis is our sound designer and mixer. Jessica Olivier is our creative consultant and script editor. Special thanks to Moth, Sam, Jin, Daile, Tore Me Away, and Moth's wonderful family for allowing me to capture our experiences. And a very warm thank you to Diane Curtis for being one of our most avid Day One listeners.
My artist name is Moth,
Mouth?
Moth.
Moth.
You know, like an ugly
Like
butterfly?
a butterfly. Excuse me.
I just had to get to the point quickly. She got it, right?